Long ago, in a small town in Italy, lived a wealthy young man named Francis Bernardone. Handsome as a prince, with friends possessed, his prospects appeared boundless. But one day he would turn his back on the world he loved, for a life so extreme that his friends and family deemed him a madman. The world would make him a saint, but sainthood was the last thing he ever wanted. The 13th century Italy was a dark age lit by the fires of war. Emperors fought against popes, cities against cities, nobles against merchants. Life was short. Disease and death lurked everywhere. But in the little town of Assisi, for the privileged few, the pursuit of pleasure eclipsed other concerns. Oblivious at the moment to the plight of those less fortunate than he, Francis Bernardone celebrated his 20th birthday.
Francis was a roustabout, vivid, colorful, life-affirming, joyous man who loved to sing, who loved jokes. A man who really loved to have a good time.
I think that Francis was a kind of playboy in his teenage years. He was certainly also a leader. And as a leader, he was always the one who was out for fun.
They called him the king of the revels. He would carouse through the streets with his friends. He would have been at the parties, which would have been anything but puritanical.
His mother hoped he would settle down and marry well. It was assumed he would inherit the family business, and that, like his father, he would one day become a luxury cloth merchant, a profession guaranteed to bring the family lots of money.
For the very first time in history, money was not merely a medium of exchange. It was an end and a goal in itself. Money was the means to power.
Francis's father was an extremely powerful figure. What we would today call a self-made man, one of the nouveau riche.
Pietro Bernardone had this desire, as most merchants did in the period, to have more and more and more. He wanted big things, and he had great plans for Francis.
Those plans were cut short. In 1202, civil war broke out with the neighboring town of Perugia. Like most wealthy young men of his day, Francis was eager to defend his beloved Assisi. Attacking ferociously, the advancing Perugian army slaughtered their neighbors. One of the first to take up arms, Francis was also one of the first captured and held for ransom. Plunged into the darkness of a damp, infested dungeon, Francis caught a severe case of malaria.
He was very ill, and that was a sobering experience. It would turn him inward and enable him to start reflecting on his life. All the meaning went out of that. There was an emptiness about it.
He had tried the life of the playboy. He had tried the family business. He had tried the glory of war. Everywhere he turned, there was nothing but disappointment.
I was very frail. I began to regard myself as worthless.
Racked with fever, he watched the weeks turn into months. Finally, after a year wasting away in near perpetual darkness, his ransom was paid. Francis was released.
He was primed for something heroic. But what that was, he as yet hadn't the remotest idea.
The year after he had been in prison, he seemed kind of aimless. He seemed to have lost a focus for his life.
Bruised and bloodied by war and disease, he was beaten down to the point at which he said to himself, there's got to be something more to life than this.
And I think that kind of experience prepared him to be receptive to God's action in his life.
Francis happened to duck into the cool of a small, half-ruined church called San Damiano.
I gazed up at a crucifix. It seemed to say to me, Francis, don't you see that my house is being destroyed? Go then and rebuild it for me.
He's in this church, and God says to him, Francis, repair my house. Can't you see it's falling into ruin? And what does he do? He looks around and he says, oh man, this church is a mess.
Now, he was very literal. He doesn't at this point see the larger meaning of that repair my house.
Most high, glorious God, enlighten the darkness of my heart and give me true faith, that I may carry out your holy and true command.
And the Francis who leaves that little chapel is very different from the man who arrives. He had to do something with his life. He had to do something.
This incident at San Damiano is a real turning point for Francis. It's not so much magical as it is life-changing.
Francis would spend quite a bit of time now just going to lonely caves, to rundown churches, praying, trying to hear this voice again.
It becomes clear to his family and to his neighbors that his manner is changing. His spirit is going through something that they can't quite catch hold of.
In order to repair the church properly, Francis needed money to buy tools. Pietro Bernardone was outraged to discover that his son got that money by selling some cloth and a horse he stole from his father's shop.
The father has been trying, week after week after month, to knock some sense into the boy. He's been patient and loving, but this time Francis has gone too far. And the only recourse for Papa is to call a town meeting.
Pietro Bernardone goes to the bishop. He summons Francis to say he can't rebuild a church with stolen money. You have to give the money back. And the whole town has gathered for this spectacle.
Francis arrives dressed beautifully and within moments takes stage center.
Until now, I have called Pietro Bernardone my father. But because I have proposed to serve God, I return to my father the money and also all the clothing which is his. And I want only to say from now on, Our Father, who art in heaven, and not my father, Pietro Bernardone.
This is very disturbing. This is a son renouncing his father, shaming him, not in the family home, but in the piazza before all the people of Assisi. His father must have been filled with sorrow. And you say, how can a saint, in quotes, how can a saint do this?
But the gesture was meaningful. What the gesture said was, I am no longer to be described or defined, and I no longer consider myself the heir apparent of this grand commercial legacy. I am nakedly following the naked Christ.
And then the bishop embraces the naked Francis with his episcopal cloak to indicate that Francis has become a child of the church. The church now will protect this poor young guy who seems crazy, but who is trying to give his life to the service of Christ.
I think he was on the brink of madness. When he left the piazza, people said, "Pazzo, pazzo, pazzo, madman." And I think that from what I know of people who were sort of treading near enlightenment, that you can go either direction. And he was hearing voices. I'm sure that he didn't know why. I'm sure he wondered himself if he was crazy.
Francis was willing to admit of himself, as one story says, as the new crazy man in the world, novellus pazzus in mundo.
When Francis renounced his father, and then he is given a peasant's garb, and he leaves Assisi, I don't think he had a clue of where he was going.
In the spring of 1206, Francis set out on the journey that effectively defined the rest of his life as a wanderer, seeker, and ultimately a saint.
The moments of shift and change and deepening in his life were extremely gradual. Conversion is the work of a lifetime for everyone. And for Francis, it certainly was the same thing.
For Francis, enlightenment was not to be found inside cloister walls, Outside, in the hills and valleys around Assisi, his real purpose awaited.
And in this area of the valley, he comes upon what's most horrifying to him, and that's a leper.
When he was young, there was a leprosarium, a place where lepers were confined, down below Assisi. If he went within 2 miles of it, that's as close as he would get, and he would hold his nose so that he wouldn't smell the disgusting smell of the lepers.
Leprosy was probably the most feared disease of the time. People didn't know where it came from, how it happened. They knew it was contagious.
The sound of the leper's clacker warned people to stay away or risk contracting this dreadful disease.
Leprosy attacks the extremities of the bones and the cartilage. The face and the nose begin effectively to rot in the living person. It produced a terrifying effect.
Remember, the leper was the ultimate outcast in Christian society. And not only the outcast, but often leprosy was seen as a mark of sin.
People were asked to pray for them. They were taken out to live in their own small little communities, only with other lepers. And for Francis, to go out to them was just unheard of.
The sight of this suffering and the loneliness was simply intolerable to him.
When I was in sin, it seemed too bitter for me to see lepers. But the Lord himself led me among them, and I showed mercy to them.
He was doing something loving and caring for a person who didn't know what it was to have a warm human touch. A person who was used to seeing people run away.
For Francis, lepers were a signal instance of the capacity of the divine to act in his life.
And soon after that, Francis was in the leprosarium, nursing the lepers, washing the pus out of their wounds. And for Francis, this was his test.
He who had been unable to look at leper houses from more than 2 miles away without quickly covering his nose, found himself able to embrace them.
And I think this is the whole secret of Francis of Assisi, that God led him to places which other people reject. And he has found their beauty, he has found their soul.
And when I left, what had seemed bitter to me was turned into sweetness of soul and body.
And without that radical shift in his approach to lepers, he wouldn't be saint, and he would hardly be recognizable to us as Francis of Assisi. This was something around which so much of Francis ultimately pivoted.
The hail fellow well met, the generous man about town who loved to provide food and drink and a great evening for his buddies, becomes a man who will literally give the shirt off his back to a needy soul.
He was always filled with joy. He would sing, and he lived like someone whose whole goal was love. Only now it was the love of God.
The Lord told me what he wanted. He wanted me to be a new kind of fool in this world. God does not wish to lead me by any other way.
Francis believed in something. He believed that God made the world and that it was good. And that the secret here is to try to make this place better in your own simple way, and don't get grandiose about it.
Francis quietly set out to follow the teachings of Jesus. While ministering to society's outcasts, he also begged for his daily bread. To his surprise, this life of simplicity and poverty began to attract followers.
People saw in him someone they could believe in. There was something authentic about him.
Francis did not originally intend to attract followers, but it was the model of Francis that began to attract others who came to him and said, "We want to live the way you live."
After the Lord gave me some brothers, those who came to receive life gave whatever they had to the poor, and were content with one tunic, patched inside and out. We desired nothing more.
You have this brotherhood forming, almost a peace movement, among ordinary guys from the different levels of society. Francis was able to provide them with another dream, another future.
Francis' notion of living the gospel had an immense appeal to people who were very troubled by the great violence in Italian countrysides and towns, who were very suspicious about this new commercial society, who were very disturbed by the increasing institutionalization and wealth of the church.
The luxury and privilege of the church stood in stark contrast to Francis's message. He preached a deeper, more personal faith.
He does this at a time when many people are unhappy with the church.
There was much scandal, a great scandal in the church at that time, especially among priests and clergy, breaking their vow of chastity.
Scandalous tales of priests who do any number of wretched things, who are avaricious, who are lazy, who can't be relied on.
Francis puts the church to shame. He was just a absolutely hardcore radical in every way. Discipline, poverty, chastity, everything, just down the line.
His lifestyle and preaching began to attract attention. Warned that he needed sanction from the Pope to preach, Francis set out for Rome.
Francis was not a priest, never became a priest, never had any intention of becoming a priest. He wanted to remain what he was, a dedicated layman.
By pleading his case directly to the Pope, this barefoot prophet risked losing everything. Undaunted, Francis was determined to meet the leader of his church.
They're going to a quite different kind of church than the one they represent. They're going from ruggedness and poverty to marble and gold thread.
Innocent III is sometimes called the Lord of the world, the most powerful pope possibly who has ever lived. And here is this barefoot, crazy man with a few followers.
Their very presence there and what Francis is talking about, a radical living of gospel poverty, is an affront to the lifestyle of the papacy, of the cardinals.
And there are some suspicions about Francis. Two cardinals say to the Pope, really, just dismiss this man as a poor beggar. He doesn't even know to put on shoes when he comes into your presence.
Innocent, however, was not just a man of power. He was also a visionary. He saw that Francis was truly a man of God. To reject him would be to reject the Gospels. And with that, he gave this barefoot prophet papal permission to preach.
The Pope saw a genuine Christ image in Francis, and Francis saw a genuine Christ image in Innocent. We can imagine Innocent saying to Francis, now you want to found a new order. Now where are you going to live? Where is your monastery? Well, Holy Father, we don't really have a monastery. We've sort of been sleeping on the banks of streams and whatever, and we're just going to go out and preach the gospel. Ah, preach the gospel, my son, Innocent might have said. So where did you get your theological training? Well, I don't have any theological training, Holy Father. I just sort of feel the Spirit of God in me, and I'm going to go preach the gospel. Innocent said yes. Innocent said yes to that. And that's extraordinary. Prophets tend not to get along well with institutional leaders. Institutional leaders tend to fear prophets. This is a moment where, at least with this pontiff and this prophet, they came together.
And Francis and his friars go on their way, and the cardinals are now probably thinking, okay, now it's back to business as usual. Well, from then on, nothing was business as usual, either in Rome or in Assisi.
On the way home from Rome, the guys sort of stopped for a while, and Francis said, now what do we do? And they talked about then, do they live as hermits away from the world, or go out and preach and teach and involve themselves in the world? At that time, they decided to be involved in the world.
Most people considered them reprehensible, disreputable, unwelcome beggars.
They were scorned and made fun of and had mud thrown at them. There was a great deal of skepticism about who this guy was.
In the spring of 1209, something happened that would forever endear Francis to people as a kind of patron saint of animals.
One day he was proclaiming the gospel and talking to people about their lives, and people were bored and they ignored him. And Francis got very angry and said, you might as well be talking to the birds. And he starts proclaiming to the birds.
And they were quiet while he was preaching. That incident could also be understood on a symbolic level.
The sermon to the birds was a favorite subject of medieval painters, for whom different types of birds symbolized different classes of people.
In the earliest medieval paintings, there are three kinds of birds. None of them particularly nice birds. He's not preaching to doves and peacocks. He's preaching to daws and crows. Fairly loud, nasty birds.
Medieval people knew that daws and crows represented laborers and poor people. These paintings communicated to a medieval audience, not that Francis spoke to the animals, but that he ministered to the lowest members of society.
If you mention St. Francis to someone, they'll say, well, he's the saint of the bird bath, isn't he? The one who talked to the birds. The saint of nature. There's some truth in that. But it skews Francis's whole life if you see him simply as a romantic lover of nature.
By the time he died, and with all the propaganda that developed afterward, it sounded like everybody just sort of grabbed him as this warm, fuzzy creature. He was not a very warm, fuzzy creature. He called people to do something hard.
He came closer to describing a perfect formula for our society globally than anybody else I know in religion. What Francis is telling you is, look, you're supposed to love one another, and you're supposed to do something about that love by trying to improve this world in little ways, like helping people who are suffering.
Let us love our neighbors as ourselves. And if anyone does not want to, let him at least do them no harm.
I think it's his tenderness towards the world that makes him so exceptional. His tenderness was inexhaustible, and it went towards everything, in every step, in every action.
Francis proclaimed peace where other people proclaimed warnings. Francis proclaimed benevolence and caring and God's love for all when others were proclaiming duty and sacrifice.
He could offer a new kind of approach to Christianity that was especially attractive to the lay people of the cities of Italy. And he did that without being angry at or dispensing the traditional structures of authority.
Without actually realizing it, Francis was pioneering a new social movement whose message appealed to both men and women. That movement was about to be enriched and complicated by a young noblewoman of Assisi named Clare Afraduccio, the daughter of a wealthy knight.
Clare had this incredible reputation for holiness that was in sync with Francis's own heart.
When she was in her early teens, she heard Francis preach in the church one day and was swept away.
Clare clearly wanted to join Francis identically. She wanted to go and live with him and to do the work that he did.
So one Palm Sunday, Clare stole away from her parents' home. She found Francis and begged him to let her join.
She gives up her beautiful, rich clothing, and Francis gives her the Franciscan simple beggar's garb.
Enlighten my heart to do penance according to your example and teaching, our most blessed Father Francis.
And Francis cuts off her hair as a symbol that Clare has given up the world.
She was his spiritual daughter.
Francis could not allow Clare to live among his friars, so he arranged for her to live at the little church of San Damiano. There, where Francis first heard the voice of God, she founded the Convent of Poor Ladies. Joined first by her sister and her widowed mother, and later by dozens of other women, Clare pursued a life of radical poverty from behind the cloister walls.
From the very beginning, there were both men and women. And Francis allowed women to be a part of this vision that God showed him.
The vision that God showed him exacted an increasing toll on Francis. As he continued to give things up, his friends feared for his survival.
He lived a hard life. He was very badly malnourished, and he pushed his body as hard as anyone could. And his body began to fail him.
During a lifetime of nursing lepers, he contracted leprosy. All of the signs of disease are beginning to take their toll on this frail body.
Felled by recurring bouts of malarial fever, in the winter of his 31st year, Francis was too weak to continue preaching. As his steadfast companion, Brother Giles, said, "If he had been robust like me, surely the world could never have kept pace with his flaming spirit."
He was weary and tired and old before his time, and wanted to leave to his friars the rounds of preaching and ministry, and he wanted to just go off and pray and be alone.
During the 4 years he was confined to his straw bed, 3,000 new friars joined the Brotherhood. As their demands increased, their leader grew weaker. Francis dictated an anguished letter to his friend Claire.
Would it not be better for me to retire to a hermitage?
Claire's reply was prompt.
You should go on preaching, because God did not call you only for yourself, but also for the good of others.
Then, to the astonishment of Claire and the Brotherhood, Francis announced his intention to set sail for Egypt and the Fifth Crusade. The Crusades affected every aspect of 13th century life. Like every good Christian boy, Francis grew up longing to answer the call to arms.
As early as Francis's childhood, this dreadful thing occurred of the capture of Jerusalem by Muslim forces. All of Christendom was in moral outrage over this.
Pagan Muslim, which is how they understood them, by their very presence in this holy place, were polluting it and defiling it. And there was a sense that that needed to be rectified.
Over the following decades, Christendom sent crusade after catastrophic crusade to rid the Holy Land of the infidel. In May of 1219, Francis embarked on such a journey to preach and convert. But like so many of his journeys, the ending was one he could not have imagined at the outset.
His decision to embark on a very risky, dangerous journey far away didn't please the friars. Many felt that he might not return.
In Muslim lands, preaching Christianity was a crime, sometimes even punishable by death.
If you went off to try to convert the infidel and died in the attempt, you won the palm of martyrdom. Francis was eager for this.
Francis arrived only to witness one of the worst battles of the Fifth Crusade.
What he encountered must have been painful and shocking. The great knights of Christendom were no better than drunken, murderous, barbaric warmongers and thieves. Killing, maiming. When he saw that, there was a sea change in his attitude.
Peace was a radical idea in the 13th century, but Francis was a radical man. He decided to cross enemy lines and try to make peace with the Sultan of Egypt himself.
He definitely felt that he had a different spiritual mission that would be more effective, that would bring about true peace.
He is escorted to the camp of the Sultan, whom he expects to be a terrible savage, bent on the wholesale destruction of good Christian people. What he finds is a highly cultured, extremely courteous, devoutly religious man.
The Sultan of Egypt had a reputation for being cosmopolitan and somewhat learned, somebody who really appreciated mystical poetry and associated with Sufi mystics.
What happened next was unprecedented. A Christian was permitted to preach to the most powerful Muslim ruler of the era.
Here were two men who, it was presumed, would endorse the gentlemanly noble art of war, the most popular game of its time.
Instead of war, they spoke of peace. Instead of censure, Francis received respect.
He realizes that this man wants peace as much as he does.
It must have been quite a shock for Francis, both in terms of the negative reaction he had to the crusade and in terms of some of the respect that he received from the Sultan. He was totally vulnerable before the Sultan. And so he came home with more things spiritually from the Sultan than he did from the Crusaders, his fellow Christians.
On the long journey home, Francis battled heat, starvation, and disease-carrying flies. His eyes became infected with trachoma, a parasitic disease that would rob him of his sight. But as his eyesight weakened, his inner vision grew stronger, with the discovery that goodness and mercy were not solely the attributes of Christians. Francis had been gone for nearly a year when the Brotherhood received news of the Crusaders' defeat in Egypt. Many gave him up for dead. When he finally came home, it must have seemed like a miracle.
The pious tradition is that a commitment of faith makes life easier. But it made nothing easy, not for Francis, as it did not for the man he called his Lord.
The great success of the movement that he started brought with it increasing problems. It's very easy when Francis is wandering around with a half dozen followers. It's a lot more difficult. How do you regularize this life when there are maybe 10,000 of these people all over Europe?
A split erupted in the order. The newer friars wanted a traditional monastic life. They began acquiring buildings and owning books. Francis struggled to hold on to his original vision of absolute poverty.
We shall live in obedience, in chastity, without anything of our own.
He seems to be castigating the brothers. Do not interpret my words. It's as though he's saying, what don't you understand about no?
He saw his original simple ideals become severely diluted to the point that his fraternity was unrecognizable to him.
The new friars prevailed, and Francis was pushed to the margins of his own order.
I'm sure that he felt betrayed.
Francis really experiences the dark night of the soul. He's suffering tremendously, both physically through his ailments, but also spiritually in the conflicts in his soul.
I feel like a corpse you take and place wherever you want. From now on, I am dead to you.
And with that, he resigned as their leader. But in this loss lay his deliverance. For in once again giving up what was dearest to him, Francis entered the final stages of his conversion. By every earthly standard, Francis of Assisi was a failure. His followers would not follow, and his peacemaking came to naught. Weak, despairing, and nearly blind, he set out to climb Mount Laverna to spend 40 days and 40 nights in prayer.
To just walk, to not know, to have given up everything. I'm sure he wondered what his life had really amounted to.
As he goes into this long retreat, he's full of doubts. Whether he's not been misguided, whether he hasn't been the victim of pride. He really believed that he had let God down.
He knew he was fairly near the end of his life. He was very ill, and therefore perhaps there was a more intense quality to the experience.
At this point, he is deeply a mystic.
He was so stripped away that he was available for anything.
Precisely what happened, we will never know. But something happened.
Some kind of resolution and acceptance that he was on the right path.
This moment in Francis's life is perhaps the most widely depicted. Medieval artists painted Francis on Mount Laverna, receiving from an angel the 5 wounds of Christ on the cross. It was the first time in history that these marks, called the stigmata, were portrayed on anyone other than Christ.
To medieval people, they were unheard of. Francis said nothing about them, as far as we know, during his lifetime.
There are those who see it as a symbol. There are those who believe that there was something physical on his body. That doesn't prove from a historian's point of view that it was brought about by this vision that he had.
Is symbolized in a way, whether it existed or not, the fulfillment of his mission to live out the life of the Gospels in imitation of Jesus.
Despite a feeble attempt to resume preaching, by winter's end, Francis could no longer walk. He asked to be carried back to San Damiano. Sadly, he could no longer see the crucifix that had spoken to him all those years ago.
He was cold, he was sick. He used suffering as a path to enlightenment.
And all of a sudden, out of that great darkness comes this great poem of light.
After a night of agony, Francis summoned the strength to dictate a poem in praise of God's creation.
He's singing his swan song, the song that he knew every troubadour sang at the end of his life that summed up their life.
All praise be yours, my Lord, through all that you have made. And first, my Lord, brother sun, who brings the day, and light you give to us through him. All praise be yours, my Lord, through sister moon and stars. In the heavens you have made them bright and precious and fair. All praise be yours, my Lord, through Sister Water, so useful, lowly, precious, and pure. All praise be yours, my Lord, through Brother Fire, through whom you brighten up the night. All praise be yours, my Lord, through Sister Death, from whose embrace no mortal can escape.
Strengthened by his frailty, enriched by his poverty, the diseased, emaciated Francis left San Damiano and prepared at the age of 44 to welcome Sister Death. He summoned his few remaining friends for a last farewell.
This man really has 2 or 3 friends at the end. He's lonely and frightened.
For 4 days, he rose and sank, whispering the Psalms. Claire and her sisters sadly received word that the end was near.
By the end, something has changed in the terror he had about death. He has seen the face of death, and she is his sister.
I am hurrying to the Lord, who I have served with my spirit.
And precisely at dusk, he very quietly died.
And the people of Assisi say that at that moment they saw larks ascending.
Only 2 years after his death, Francis was made a saint by the Church of Rome. A grand basilica was built to hold his remains in Assisi. Today, tens of thousands of Franciscans and millions of men and women around the world continue his ministry. But perhaps he is most widely known by the prayer written in his honor during World War I. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life.